Hello and welcome back to another episode of the ScotLand Matters podcast, where we explore the major issues shaping rural Scotland. I'm Cameron Gillies, Head of External Affairs at Scottish Land and Estates, and today we're asking a big question about Scotland's land reform journey. Where might it end? It's a subject that sparked debate for decades. Land reform has been about fairness, accountability and working with communities, but it's also about practical realities, how we use land to tackle climate change, restore nature, produce food and energy and sustain our rural communities. And joining me to unpick this complex and sometimes controversial debate are two people at the heart of it. Michael Russell, Chair of the Scottish Land Commission and former Environment Minister and External Affairs Secretary. Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
Sarah Jane Laing, Chief Executive of Scottish Land and Estates. Sarah Jane, welcome to the podcast again. Now, this discussion actually started back in May at our annual conference, and many of our listeners will remember the debate that took place in the Assembly rooms a few short months ago. In today's discussion, I hope we can delve into many of the points that were raised there a little more deeply. So let's jump right into it. Michael, I'm going to start with you as somebody who was first elected in 1999, many land reform bills ago. I think it'd be great just to set the scene for us. Why do you think land reform has been such a recurring theme in Scottish politics over the last few decades?
I think for two reasons. I think, first of all, it was something that didn't happen very much until the Parliament came along in 1999. And therefore, there was a lot of unfinished business in modernising land holding and land tenure and land issues. I think the second one is it's a touchstone issue for many people in Scotland. They want to have a modern relationship with the land. And they see some, but not all, but some of the present land ownership patterns not to reflect how they think land should be used and how they think they should be able to talk about land should be used, particularly in places where they live. So it's that type of touchstone issue. Some people have identified it as being a hangover from the past, and I'm sure we'll hear that at some stage. But the reality is it's people saying we have a right to be heard. We don't think that property is the only right that should be recognised in Scotland, and we want to make sure that we can use the land and see the land used for the public benefit. And it's that public benefit thing that is at the bottom of it. Land is an asset which has to be used for the public good, and land reform is about how that happens. Now, the agenda for land reform comes from the Scottish Government, and the Land Commission is not the Scottish Government. We were charged by the 2016 Act of essentially taking forward land reform and arguing for it and administering parts of it. But we're not the Scottish Government. It's the political decisions of the Scottish Government, any Scottish Government, that drive the agenda when push comes to shove.
And SJ, you've been in and around this conversation about land reform for a similar number of years, almost. How do you think the debate has evolved over the last couple of decades? Does it remain kind of rooted in the arguments of the past, or is the current debate more about looking to the future, do you think?
I think it's a really interesting question because there's not just one debate about land reform. And I think there are many people, including the Scottish Land Commission, Scottish Land and Estates, who are trying to frame sort of land issues very much in what do we want to see delivered from our land? What are the multiple benefits for people, jobs and nature that we want to see? The problem is that at the same time you have debates going on which are looking back. We still hear the phrase, how do we right historical wrongs? You still have a focus from some people purely on ownership. And you also have a focus from some people purely on protection of private property rights. So the land reform debate is really wide and really varied. I mean, I would agree with Mike about land being a touchstone issue. And I think for Scottish Land and Estates, land reform is about that kind of balance of land rights and responsibilities. It's how do we use land to deliver houses? How do we use land to deliver the public interest test or the public interest in its widest sense? And I think, Mike, this is one of the issues that very recently I think we've kind of the idea of what that public interest is so varied in Scotland that it's maybe led to quite a lot of conflict because, public interest for some people is delivering economic growth, whereas others feel that it's all about net zero and, never the twain shall meet. So I think land kind of feels as though it's kind of at times stuck in the middle of debates about what indeed is the public interest in Scotland. And I think for many of our members, What is the end goal? What does success look like? What is being asked of me? How do I make that contribution?
Well,
Is
we've been
where a lot of the questions are being asked just now.
Well, the Land Commission is asking those questions at the moment. I mean, the Scotland Futures project we're undertaking starts with the question, what does a land reform Scotland look like? But I'm very cautious, particularly as an ex-historian, about saying, let's ignore the past. The past essentially is the foundation on which we build both the present and the future. And the past in Scotland, there has been substantial difficulty, injustice in land ownership. There have been substantial issues that people want addressed. Now, you can't avoid that. You can't say, let's put that all behind us. What you have to do is to say, let us recognize that, and then let's find a way to take this argument to a place where we're all reasonably happy with the outcome. And that's what we need to try and do, to find a place where we are all reasonably happy with the outcome. So we don't go on having this debate and creating the lack of confidence that this debate can sometimes have forever. But that's going to require a lot of hard talking and a lot of hard thinking. And it's also going to have to confront the past and say there are things in that past that were very bad indeed. And we need to move on from that. But we can only do that when we acknowledge it.
So I kind of half agree. I mean, I agree that you have to learn from the history. You can never ignore that past. And I think that depends on whether we're looking at, rural depopulation, understanding why young people moved away and are still moving away from our rural areas. My worry is that if you frame a future policy based purely on righting historical wrongs, which, when the bill was first introduced, that was one of the major lines from the Cab Sec at the time. That's when you start to kind of fall down. I think if you're absolutely right, understanding how people's feelings and views have been shaped and understanding how that shaped their current position. But we should be looking at what future, just as you said there, what future do we want to see from Scotland, understanding and accepting what has happened in the past?
Well, one of the things we need to say to ourselves is if land is an asset, which an asset that earns, and it is an asset that earns, particularly now, it's a very valuable asset, who's benefiting from that asset? Is it an individual who's benefiting from that asset? Or is it people who live on that land who should benefit from the asset? Or is society as a whole benefiting from that asset? And that's a question that we shouldn't be afraid of asking, and we need to find some answers to it. Because we have money coming in from renewables, for example, but we don't have money coming in from other uses of land that relates directly to communities. And it's not enough to say, oh, well, it's employment. Sometimes it's not employment, or there's very little employment. So we have to ask who's going to benefit from this, and how do we help them to benefit? How do we make sure they do benefit?
And I don't think it's an either or. I think in that, the way it should work is that all of the above, the people who are making that investment, who are maybe taking the risk, they have to have some kind of return. They have to have some kind of benefit.
Don't
And you
that.
would imagine, and because we operate in a world where we can't just do what we want on our own land, it should be delivering for the public interest in terms of, a lot of what's happening on Scotland's land just now has been driven very much by public policy, Scottish Government, UK policy, saying we want to see these things happen across Scotland. And you're right, in terms of community benefits, sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's indirect. It can be about, attracting new visitors, supporting micro businesses. It's not always linked. It's not always that kind of direct, here's a lump sum cash as it is with renewables. But I think sometimes that the feeling is that balance is slightly out of kilter at times. You're absolutely right. But one of the questions that we have been asked that's often asked from so a land-based business is asked to make that contribution to the community in a way that other businesses. So, if you had a very successful business operating in a rural area, they're not asked, how are you making a contribution to the community beyond the kind of economic growth? And
they're not using a shared asset.
Yeah.
I mean, the difference there is very often, land is a shared asset. So, the business that is using the land is using a shared asset. It's an asset essentially that belongs to the community as well as to the individual landowner. That is not the case in other businesses. Businesses operate in a different way. But I think what you and I could agree on is we need to get this debate to the stage where people feel that there has been sufficient progress and that they don't want to go on legislating every 10 years. I agree with you, and you and I have had this conversation before. I think to go on legislating, and also for the focus of that legislation to become quite diffuse now, we need to bring that back and say, what are we actually trying to achieve? And again, that's why Scotland Futures is a project that I'm very keen on, because we need to say to ourselves, how do we get there? And where are we trying to go anyway? rather
Yeah,
than. I think the current bill, there's some very good things in it. I would defend it. It's not our bill, it's a government's bill. We've done our best to help the government to improve it. But I do think that just to go on legislating every 10 years is not the answer.
so, Michael, picking up on that point about what are we actually trying to achieve, I would say it's really good to kick this conversation off with a couple of points of consensus, certainly around delivering public good with Scotland's land. But I wanted to ask, land reform is often described as a journey, and from the Land Commission's perspective, what, in your view, is the destination? What are we actually trying to achieve with this bill?
Well, I think that's going to come out of. I'm not going to be tempted to give my own version. I'm going to wait for that to come out with Scotland Futures. But if I were to tiptoe onto that, I would say that we need to redress the balance between those people who live on the land and those people who own the land to make sure that the benefit that accrues from land, the public benefit that accrues, is more widely spread and it's spread in a way that is more equitable. I think we also, and I'll give you a point of consensus. I think Sarah Jane was right to say that there's more than one debate in this. There's another debate about the fact that there are some very, very good examples of people doing excellent things. There are also some awful examples of people who appear to have just come out of the 19th century or the 18th century or the 17th century in the way in which they treat people. And that is something that we actually need to be very severe about, because that's not acceptable in 21st century Scotland. Sarah Jane and I first worked together on the issues of wildlife crime many years ago when I was Environment Minister. And the argument then was, the good people will drive the bad people out, and in the end, everybody will do well. It didn't work that way. The good people remained good, usually, and did good things. The bad people just shrugged and got on and did what they wanted to do. And that's something that we need to be very, very strong about, that has to come to an end, and that those people who think that owning an estate or a large tract of land gives them the right to treat other people as if they are inferior has gone.
Yeah, and as Cameron knows, and that's something that we do support. We are not apologists for bad behaviour. It's the reason why we updated our members' charter to make it quite clear what we see as the basis for good, responsible land ownership and land management in Scotland. I think when you're, in terms of kind of what we're trying to do, my worry is that often we kind of go first to regulation, not the Land Commission. I have to say the Land Commission we've worked really constructively with in terms of promoting good practice, inspiring people, showing them what's possible. I accept, Mike, that works for 95% of the cases, that, you can inform and educate and inspire some people. But there are times when, you do have to look at backstop measures. I think my worry, but you use the word diffuse, I think one of the problems of creating a sort of a punitive approach is still when you're unclear as to what people are being punished for because they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be delivering. And I do kind of worry that if we aren't clear as to kind of what is the breach, and I think that's one thing that actually the Tenant Farming Commissioner Bob McIntosh was really clear as to kind of what constitutes a breach and how do we help remedy that. That's great. When it's kind of hard to describe what we're actually breaching, that's when I start to get worried about a kind of regulatory base.
Well, of course, we don't know yet what the content of the secondary legislation will be that will define that process. Sorry, Cameron, to go into some of the technicalities of this, but it's really quite important. Right. So we don't know exactly how that is going to be defined. But I would agree with you that certainly penalties should not be incurred if people don't know what they've done. I mean, that is massively unjust, and we wouldn't support that. But it is necessary to have a backstop, because we have seen this frequently in the past, that those people who are willing to do well, who want to do well, who treat people well, that's fine. But those people who won't, at the end of the day, you have to have the stick as well as the carrot. And therefore, the issue is also about how you use the stick. And therefore, the Commission has been very, very leery about seeing those sticks used. But they do have to be used from time to time. The Tenant Farming Commissioner has some of them. The Commission has very few, and there will be more coming along. But I would regard it as a failure if we use those in anything like the number of cases that I hear some people speculating about.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of stick and a lot of legislation coming down the line recently, and we're dealing with land reform, but we're also looking at a multitude of bills, including housing bills or minimum energy efficiency standards, or now the Natural Environment Bill and Deer Management Nature Restoration Orders contained within that. Esther, are you concerned that the level of stick in comparison to carrot is driving people away from the sector? Is it having an impact on investment? It's an argument that is put forward during evidence sessions around the land reform bill. But do you think that this is something that could impact the much needed investment that we need in the rural sector? Just to talk about that carrot and stick a little bit more.
I think there are some cases where regulation is required, where there are some areas where clarity through regulation has been the right approach. I think in other areas, I would say that some politicians and indeed some civil servants struggle to understand how they can influence without control. And I think maybe as stakeholders, we and others haven't been able to either come up with an alternative or facilitate the speed of change that we possibly should have done. The problem often has been things like lack of resources. How do you support that? Again, back to the work that the both Land Commission and Nature Scot do. We were really worried at the last budget round when we looked at being asked to do more but with less money. As regulatory bodies, you have to focus that resource on what you have to do. Now, the things that kind of drop by the wayside are good practice, spreading the word, bringing people education, training, skills development, all of that. So I do worry that, that we do tend to focus on the lowest common denominator at all times, accepting Mike's point that at times you do have to have that backstop. So I think the balance is out of kilter at the moment. And as I say, I think some of that is because we have an executive, a government who does seem to see or struggle to understand how it influences without control.
Yeah.
I'm really keen on simplification. I'm really keen on simplification. I always have been. In my long period as a minister in various portfolios, I've always been keen on simplification. But we also have to say there is no evidence that anybody has been, driven out of the countryside by regulation. In fact, the reverse is true, because when you look at the property prices, property prices have continued to rise. That there's an active market in property. People want to buy it. People want to be in the countryside. So in all those circumstances, proportionate regulation is the right thing to do, but not over-regulation, and I entirely agree with that. And also not always using regulation. If you believe that regulation should only be used as a last resort, then you don't use it on everybody. And sometimes there is a tendency to say one size fits all, and we have to be very careful about that. But I don't buy I just simply don't buy the argument that, people are not going to invest in the countryside because of regulation. I see with my own eyes how people are investing.
I'd maybe push back on that slightly. I think a few reports from land agents and sort of legal organisations involved in the rural sector have suggested that there are concerns from investors about the current legislative landscape. But I think
there could be concerns. But sorry, the Land Commission does undertake its own independent work on this. We do it on an annual basis, and I think that's well respected. I think we're about to go into our 5th year of it. The evidence does not support that. I mean, undoubtedly, there are anecdotes about lots of things, and occasionally an anecdote is correct, but actually the evidence does not support it.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a sort of difference here between the kind of land market, and I totally support Mike that can you look at that, there's still demand for Scottish land. People are still buying Scottish land. Farmers are buying farmland, and it's one of the things that we've seen. We are seeing a slight slowdown in some areas. Commercial forestry is one of them, and that is linked to not just the regulatory, but it's linked to the return on investment. Where we are seeing feedback, Mike, is definitely from people who already own land and property in Scotland, who are sort of saying, I'm looking at what my investment plans are. I'm waiting to see kind of what happens. I'm waiting to see what happens in terms of regulation. I'm waiting to understand what this kind of means. So I do think that for those current landowners in Scotland, there might be some reticence in terms of investment. But lots of them, because lots of them have, they're already halfway through 25, 30-year investment plans. The other point I was going to make in terms of some of the investment, what we're also seeing is sometimes Scottish Government policy and regulations which are kind of counterproductive. And Mike, you'll be aware of some of the stuff that we had, Mike, where the way hydro schemes were being treated from a kind of business rates point of view, and we've often have some of that I think Scottish Government doesn't always join the dots across different departments where you do kind of get the kind of over-regulation.
I mean, I keep saying, and I say regularly at meetings elsewhere, I'm not the Scottish Government. It's a great thing to be able to say that. I'm delighted to say it. The reality is, of course, there will be issues that need to be addressed. There are sometimes regulatory issues that are plain wrong and need to be sorted. I was involved in a hydro issue myself when I was an MSP with a substantial hydro operation, which was being treated in my view, very foolishly. But the reality of the situation is, as long as you recognise that where those problems exist, they need to be sorted. That's the right thing to do. I mean, we can stray into, and I don't want to stray into, but you can stray into the politics of this, where there is an argument, of course, on one side of the political spectrum that regulation is a bad thing. There's an argument on the other side of the spectrum that says regulation is essential. Somewhere between those two of them, there is, I think, a broad agreement that we need to have regulation to protect people, to protect the environment, to get things happening properly, but we should be careful about it. And we certainly shouldn't use it as a weapon of first resort. That would not be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the conversation so far, but I'm going to move it on a little bit. Just ask a question about whether or not it's more important what we do with land or who owns land, and how do we ensure that the delivery of nature recovery, of new housing projects, of producing food, of delivering energy, isn't conflicting with this overarching goal of redistributing land that underpins the Land Reform Bill. I'll go to you on that first, SJ. Is there a conflict between the two?
I suppose there are two big questions, and I think for if I take the second one first, if that's okay, there's clear evidence that that delivery at scale is very successful. If you look at the work that's happening with Cairngorms Connect and others, whether it's in terms of woodland creation, peatland restoration, and again talking about some of the stuff that we did about investment. When you can invest at scale, it does it delivers at scale in terms of those benefits. Fragmentation for fragmentation's sake does concern me. I think if you are truly going to look at how do you use an ownership pattern to deliver the best outcomes, that to me should also include accepting and valuing the scale, what's delivered by large-scale land holdings. And ironically, I think that the evidence from the Scottish Land Commission that's been used to, I suppose, used as a basis of the policy rationale for lotting does accept that. It does talk about the benefits which can be delivered by large-scale land holdings. So that's kind of been forgotten about at times in the debate. The 2019 report from the Scottish Land Commission didn't say big is bad, but that kind of rhetoric kind of fed into an awful lot of the current thinking on the bill. Does it put some of this at risk? Yes, it could. And I think that's what we're trying to kind of, Mike touched on what's in the bill, that's what we've been trying to get the government to think about in terms of some of its current proposals on prior notification and lotting. And Mike, I don't want to paraphrase the Land Commission, but I think we've all sort of said, be really careful about decisions that are being made when you're looking at prior notification and lotting, to look at what the long-term outcomes are, not just do it on the basis of the fragmentation of the ownership. It should be about thinking about what is delivered beyond that diversity.
Well, again, we're addressing a situation with huge complexity, and there is no one answer that fits this. It's phrased. The first part of your question was always phrased. Is it ownership or is it usage? It's actually both. And there's an interaction between the two, and the interaction can exist in large scale or it can exist in small scale. If I may introduce Andy Whiteman's name into this just for a moment, he wrote a really interesting blog this week about what the situation in Braemar and the fact and illustrating whatever the rights and wrongs of that situation, illustrating that a blanket threshold doesn't answer lots of questions. Because you can actually have things happening well below that threshold which should concern people. So the simple answer to a very complex question is, first of all, it is both ownership and usage that matters. And good usage, for example, large amounts of peatland restoration being undertaken on major scale is a good thing to happen. But equally, small scale things on an island or elsewhere where there are changes taking place require to be looked at very carefully. And in terms of usage, that's also a complex web. The best land should be used for growing food, undoubtedly, but there are other demands upon it as well. So how do we juggle that? And of course, individuals in the market play a role in that and have to play a role in that. And it'd be foolish to deny that. But we just need to be aware of these issues, and we must not simplify them to say all ownership is good or all ownership is bad, all scale is good, or no scale is good. We just need to be aware of the circumstances and apply some sense to them.
Yeah, and I think, you talked at the start about the land reform debate, and I think we've probably teased out as to kind of how nuanced it is. But like many issues in society just now, it has become sound bites and polarisation. The reality is that, Scottish Land Estates and Andy Whiteman actually agree on a number of things relating to land policy, land use, land ownership, land policy, including things like transparency of ownership. So there's lots of things like that are part of this wider debate that, unfortunately, back to thing, it gets boiled down to headlines and grandstanding, and the nuances get missed far too often when we're talking about land.
I think I possibly fell into that modern political trap of presenting a false dichotomy there, Michael, and you're absolutely right to call that out in your answer. But let's talk a little bit about that sort of grey area. And a lot of that grey area can be around engaging with communities and the relationship between landowners and the communities in the land that they own. So the bill clearly aims, the bill that we're dealing with just now, it aims to strengthen ties between landowners and local communities. That's one of the sort of fundamental pieces that underpins what the government are trying to do from our perspective. And what could that actually look like in practice, and how might it help build trust rather than just add red tape? So I think there's a real concern that it's just going to add to the bureaucratic burden that landowners are already facing and that community groups are already facing. How can we build trust, and how can we make sure that it isn't just a meaningless piece of bureaucracy?
Communication is absolutely vital. People have to be able to talk to each other. I've seen some really good examples. I mean, if I look at, let me mention the Luss Estates, where they have two communities that have done place planning. Those place plans are part of the estate plans. There is a communication that takes place there. So the community knows what it wants, and the estate knows its role in making sure that happens. It's not a complete role because other people have roles to play. And that's an example of good communication and an agreement on how things move forward. Bad communication is that the landowner simply, if that doesn't say anything, just offers the land for sale to somebody else without anybody saying anything, without telling the community, or starts developments without having any engagement with the community. Making community engagement compulsory shouldn't be necessary in most cases because it's advantageous to landowners to know that they're working with communities rather than against them. But where there is a reluctance to see the community playing any role, or only lip service paid, where, a recent case where an estate went on the market with 12 hours notice to the community, in all those circumstances, then there needs to be an enforcement mechanism.
I mean, I think those are valid points. And Mike said communication. I think my one would be relationships, which, of course, communication is part of that. So, effective engagement builds relationships. And we've seen, as Mike said, we've seen some really, really good examples of where everyone with an interest in a local area, landowners, businesses, communities and others have come together to create a shared vision. And I think for me that it is about that kind of what's our shared vision for this area, and how do I play my part in helping deliver that. I think there's a few things just to kind of flag up that I do think, Mike, that there's sometimes this little bit of a kind of idyllic view of communities being a kind of harmonious group of people who all have the same shared vision.
I've represented many communities over the years. I'm trying not to be cynical about it.
No,
but I do not have a rainbow.
No, I know you don't, and I know again the Scottish Land Commission has been quite clear in some of the stuff that they've been trying to help communities as well, trying to do if I call it the kind of pre-work. But before you start talking to others, talk to each other, kind of thing, work in terms of supporting that. And we've had members who kind of have felt that they've started an engagement process and they're suddenly stuck between two or three groups of community who all want different things. And I think that's one of the things that members are looking for kind of more support on, I'm really glad that the Scottish Government is sticking with community of geography. I was really worried at one point that we might see communities of interest actually starting to kind of muscle in and override almost kind of some of the local community of geography's needs and wants.
2016, 15 and 16, and I think the arguments presented for community of interest just do not hold water. They're far too difficult and far too dangerous in actual fact in terms of fragmenting things.
Yeah, and I think, so Cameron, Mike and I have just been involved in the development of the consultation for the review of the community right to buy provisions. And I think as a stakeholder group, Mike, I think we came up with some really sensible discussions about how we can improve that for everybody. But the one thing that I thought kind of united all of us was the importance of community of geography, and for everyone in that community to have a valid voice, because people were feeling that often some things are driven by a kind of vocal minority, and it's only at certain times that the future of the community or other voices in the community then become heard. So I think that was I think for me really heartening to know that there was such consensus about the importance of the retention of community of geography.
And I think there's also a pretty strong recognition that the reality of this situation on the ground is that communities of geography are the things that can work, because that's where essentially the centre of power lies. I mean, all that we're talking about is about power. It's about who exercises power, how power is exercised, how power is shared. And I think it's much more obvious to see how that sharing can take place in a geographic setting than a setting that becomes much more diffuse. And therefore, I think there's a nervousness about seeing it going elsewhere. I think it just has to stay where it is. But actually, I think these issues of making sure that communities have the right to be heard, are taking part in that, those dialogues, are essentially joint shareholders in an enterprise within a community, is very valuable indeed. And that makes the biggest difference of all. But, at the end of the day, it is communities that have to be able to say, we have a vision of our future, come and join us and let's do this together, rather than simply being pushed or told what to do.
One of the things about engagement that we have found that we're needing to support members on, and indeed I think there's further support needed for communities, is when they can influence, because often, with the trickle down, by the time the landowner is talking about developing a certain area or changing land use, that's as a result of, national planning framework, regional policies, drivers from Scottish Government, all of these things. And often the landowner it's kind of that last step. And communities or, individuals often only get involved when they see a planning application or trees starting to be planted. So it's also trying to get people to understand how they can influence government thinking, how they can influence the kind of national conversations, Scottish Land Commission, the Scotland Futures, there's other things that set the scene that will then determine how, a piece of land is used in the future. And it's a really hard task because, everyone lives really busy lives. You often don't realise how something's going to impact on you until you kind of see it on your doorstep. But yep. I think there's some work to be done there, isn't there, in improving local democracy, in improving the community council.
And improving the quality of advice that's given.
Yeah.
I mean, I very much agree with you that one of the roles that I want to see the Commission expand, it's very difficult for us to do so financially because we're a small organisation, we don't have the resources, but I would really like us to be able to offer our advice services, our training, our skill services as widely as possible throughout Scotland and to every community that requires them. Because actually being able to say at the beginning of the process, this is what you'll have to do, this is how it works, and also helping to heal rifts in the community before they become rifts that damage any progress, that is the type of thing we should be doing much more of. The Land Commission Board has already said that they want to expand that work, but it can only be expanded with the resource that's made available to us to do so.
Yeah. So that's great to hear, because I think there's certainly a feeling, because of the lack of local place plans in places, that the landowners' land management plans were going to have to become a sort of pseudo-local place plan, which is not what they should be.
No, absolutely.
So that was a real worry that we had, that, it was filling a vacuum. That was a kind of deficit in terms of local democracy or delivery by local agencies.
Empowered communities, that word power again, empowered communities who know how to operate, who know what the legislation is like, can be helped to move forward in that way, working with landowners to make sure that there's a shared vision that it would be the ideal situation. Now, there's some places that it does work, but we need to empower communities far more than we have done.
SJ, Mike, we are coming to the end of the podcast. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation, and I think we could go on for absolutely hours. But I've just got 3 quick-fire questions for you, which I'll come to you in turn to answer. The first one is, what would success look like in terms of Scotland's pattern of land ownership? The second one is, what role can politicians play in taking the rhetoric out of this debate and making it a more evidence-based conversation? And finally, what's the one change that you would make to the bill to make it workable for communities and for landowners in Scotland? I can read them out again if you need me to, but I'll come to you first, Mike.
Oh my goodness me, what a set of questions.
Quick fire, my goodness.
What success looks like? We'll know what people think about success when we see the outcome of Scotland Futures. We're going to publish an interim document, I think, in November, and then the final thing in January or February.
Sticking to that line, well done.
I think what we will get out of that is a clear view of the majority view in Scotland, which wants to see continuing change, engagement with communities, and landowning being seen more and more as a matter of social responsibility and public benefit. Secondly, to ask politicians to wind down the rhetoric in advance of an election strikes me as, whatever the definition of whistling in the wind is, it's absolutely whistling in the wind. However, you're right that what people need to do is to recognise where the solutions lie in this. And I hope another thing that Scotland Futures Project will bring forward a series of not recommendations, but some information that says that's what the road looks like. And that's how long the road will take to travel. And we think that, there should be a commitment to that road. And the one change to the bill, that is a really hard thing. I think the one change to the bill, and I'm going to do a technical thing here, is non-contiguous holdings. I still think that the issue of non-contiguous holdings needs further address. It's very hard to do, but there will be individuals and companies in Scotland who will not be bound by the bill, who own substantially more than the 1,000 hectare threshold. And I think it's an area which has proved very difficult to deal with, but it does need to be dealt with, because nobody should be, if this law applies, and this law should apply across Scotland, it should apply to all those who are owning land above a certain level, not just those who fall into one category of that.
Great, thanks for that, Michael. I'll come to you next, SJ.
What does success look like in terms of Scotland's pattern of land ownership? For me, is it an acceptance that we have a diversity of land ownership, we have opportunities. So it's increasing those opportunities for people to enter the market, to have access, and at the same time accepting that large land holdings in a rural country play an important part. It's a difficult one for me, Mike, because I see a shifting pattern of land ownership. I see new buyers coming in. I look at some of the older estates, well-established estates, and I know the number of house sites that would make it available, the number of opportunities they're creating for micro businesses. And I don't always think that that's recognised in that, again, a blunt 43250 figure that Andy Whiteman has thrown about, and others have grasped on, that the diversity of land ownership that we have in Scotland, I think, is already greater than some accept. It's funny, Mike, you asked about how do we shift the rhetoric. I know it's all about the votes. So I think Mike's right. In terms of this year, this is not the time for us to start having nuanced discussions about land reform. But it's an interesting one, because when you look at the Scottish Government's own research, land reform per se doesn't come top of voters' minds. But, Mike and I know that it's housing, it's other things, and the correlation in people's minds between land reform and delivery of housing is one that we do have to, and other things that we do have to accept. But yeah, it's all about votes. What's the one change you'd make to the bill? The number of flaws, technical flaws within this bill is still huge. We met with the bill team yesterday. They accept that there are things that are flawed. I was told not by the bill team but by someone within the Scottish Government to stop focusing on getting it right and focus on getting it through. Now, if that's how we are developing Scottish land, land legislation, I have real worries. One change to the bill, I would take out the parts which deal with prior notification and lotting. And if we really want to look at those, we bring them in alongside the review of the community right to buy legislation that we're doing, and we look at those all together. The land management plans, I think, could work. The ag holdings, quite a lot of that we want to see. We need to take changes to resumption in 2003 Act out altogether, but maybe lift those prior notification lotting measures and have a proper look at them, because they do not work as drafted.
Well, we don't know whether they work as drafted, but we think they're improved enough to be able to work. But I have to say, with the greatest respect, if those items were not in the bill, then the argument would be made that the Scottish Government and Scotland was not serious about altering the situation. You talked about large-scale landowning. I'm sure that there are other places of large-scale landownings, but they're bigger. The reality of the situation here is that Scotland is an outlier in terms of land ownership and individuals involved in land ownership. And Scotland needs to modernise the relationship between its people and its land. And that is what land reform is about. And so far, that hasn't taken place to the extent that I think the people of Scotland have indicated they want it to happen, nor has it taken place, perhaps equally importantly, to the extent that it has benefited the people of Scotland, who essentially are sharing in the riches of the land of Scotland, in my view.
Yeah, and if you look at that, the pattern of land ownership and the pattern of land management that we have, the unique situation that we have in Scotland is celebrated by some. It's something that draws investment, it draws tourists, it draws others to our country, and I do think that we have to have we have to think about what that change might do to the future landscapes that we have, the future investment, the heritage that is such a huge driver, that the whisky industry and others. What will those changes that we're talking about mean? And
I don't think it'll mean anything for the whisky industry, but I think if we were to say that Scotland draws people to it because we have an unequal system of land ownership and an unequal distribution of power, then I think I would want to make sure that we altered those things, and they were even more, and the country would then become more attractive to most people.
I think maybe the point is that Scotland's an outlier in many other ways than its pattern of land ownership. It's types of land ownership, things like crofts, which are unemulated elsewhere in the world.
But back to that, I think lots of things come to Scotland, whether that's tourism, whether it's investment, whether it's heritage status, whether it's UNESCO heritage status in the Flow Country, have been achieved because of the pattern of land ownership that we have. So let's not suggest that all of that is negative.
Well, we started on areas of agreement. We're ending on areas of disagreement.
People would be disappointed if we didn't.
Listen,
I do think that that is not why people come to Scotland, and I think Scotland has a huge task in front of it to make sure that we have a pattern of land ownership that is fair to people.
Yeah.
I think it's been clear there's areas of consensus and there's continuing to be areas of disagreement, and this debate isn't going anywhere. Scotland's relationship with land, I think we've heard, is a little bit about identity, a little bit about politics, a little bit about fairness, but we also know that it's about meeting the challenges that we face in terms of climate, in terms of nature, in terms of producing food and sustaining our rural communities. So there's lots of areas of consensus there. Michael, SJ, thank you very much for joining us.
And this is round two. I'm sure there'll be a round three before too long.
We look forward to it. And to our listeners as well, thank you for listening to the Scotland Matters podcast. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share this episode with anyone who you think will enjoy the episode and who cares about the future of rural Scotland.
Thank you.